So on our first panel, what's really interesting, I think, is that we have both the European Union represented as well as the private sector. And our first speaker will be Megan Richards, who is in North America right now, but has worked and I believe is still working right now for the European Commission, or are you on a leave from the European? She's on sabbatical. She's been working for the European Commission for many years now, and I noticed that many of her duties there have been in the research field. She's had a number of postings that have dealt with research, the DG research, as well as the European Union research framework programs, but has also now moved into the area of dealing with networks and network services and communications networks, content, and technology, which is, you know, one of those nice acronyms that the EU always comes up with, CONNECT, which is works very well. So she will speak to us from the perspective of the European Union, and I think that will give us a very interesting, you know, kind of insider perspective on what I've been talking about until now. And then we're very lucky to have with us as well one of the leading French entrepreneurs in this field of the digital economy, Gilles Babinet, who's come to us just from Europe, straight from Europe. And he is, it says in your biography, a serial entrepreneur, and I'm not sure what that means, except I think it probably means that it's a whole string of things that you've been doing in this field. And he was named the digital champion by the French minister in this area. Now, in terms of what we're talking about today, he represents France in the digital agenda for Europe, and you can read about all of his really impressive accomplishments in terms of getting this sector really active in the French, the European, and I think you could say in the global context, because it's really spread to that dimension. So I will turn over the floor first to Megan and then to Gilles, and then we'll see where the time is, whether we have time for questions then or whether we'll have to wait till later with the moderated discussion.
So first of all, I think this is a very interesting, well, first it's always a very interesting time to be here. The European economy is going through, well, a bit of a disaster, has been through a bit of a disaster. It's supposed to be improving. Canada, the United States, and other countries have also suffered to a certain extent. But I think the other thing that's interesting from a Canadian perspective too is to see how the EU works. I'm not going to go into a long, detailed, and horrible discussion about subsidiarity and institutionalization of the European Union. It's even more complex than federal-provincial relations. But there are similarities in the sense that you have, of course, federal powers, provincial powers. We have EU level, national, regional, city actors. And I think the most important thing about the digital agenda for Europe is that it brings all the actors together, and of course it can't possibly be done without everyone working together. And so this is one of the challenges amongst many, and Gilles will tell you from the French perspective what's going on, but I'm sure he would agree too that one of the most important aspects of all these activities is to get everyone on board and make sure everyone is doing their bit to push forward. And in the Canadian context, of course, this is important too, between federal, provincial, regional actors. So first of all, let me give you, also I'm the director of what's called coordination at DG Connect at the European Commission, but for the moment I'm at Harvard for a year on kind of sabbatical. I'm doing a research project, you will appreciate this, on telecom regulation and internet regulation and the comparison between the EU and the US. And whether or not this is stifling or encouraging innovation and what should be done to improve. So that's where I am and what I'm doing. As I suspected, I can't make this thing work. Push the button. Yeah, this one?
Yep, it worked.
It worked. Good. Okay. So as I started off, and you know very well too, especially those of you who are economists or work in the real world, the world economy has not done particularly well, particularly in the West over the last few years. And in Europe, we established something called Europe 2020 strategy, which was to try to bring and put the European economy back on board. One of the flagships of that strategy for 2020 is the digital agenda for Europe, which you can see. Better not try anything dramatic. But it's the first of the issues there. There are a whole series of other flagships, and of course they're all interrelated. They work together. You've mentioned opening up education, which is a very interesting case too, because the European Commission is not responsible for education, the member states are. But of course, what we have to do is try to make sure everyone works together and goes forward. So I'll try to give you a very brief overview of what the digital agenda does, where it's supposed to go, and also last year in December we had what we called a review of the agenda, because as you know, those of you who work in ICT know that things move very, very quickly. What were considered to be the top priorities in 2010, by the end of 2012 had changed slightly. It's not that the priorities had changed, but the focus had changed slightly. So this review refocused a bit the digital agenda. These are just some issues showing why ICT matters. I suppose I don't have to tell you this, right? You all know. So I'm going to skip this slide then. But in the European Union, it's particularly important because we think it is really the key to growth. We have not the resources of Canada, we don't have the agriculture of Canada, we don't have the vast spaces of Canada. Well, I suppose altogether, perhaps almost. So we have to use our minds and skills and do something different and dramatic to drive forward the economy. And you have all seen these statistics, I'm sure, about how increase in broadband coverage has an increase in GDP, using ICT more increases GDP, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not going to talk about all of those things, but I thought you might like to see this graph, which gives a view of digital performance between the European Union and some other major global actors, the United States, Canada, et cetera. Of course, the closer you are to one, the better it is. And just as an anecdote, though, we always, in Europe, look at Japan, Korea, but often the United States. And Gilles will appreciate this too. When I moved to Boston at the end of August, I moved into my new rental place, and I thought, wonderful, here I am, the center of intellectual dynamism, the center of the new economy, everything's going to work perfectly. I came with my son, who's a second-year university student, turned on our various digital devices. We could hardly get anything to work. It really didn't work at all. I thought, what's going on? We're supposed to be at the center of, intellectual activity. Here, we're always talking about the internet economy. The United States is doing all sorts of things. Broadband access with an old dial-up thing between 0.5 and 1 megabits per second. And I said, so I phoned the landlord. I said, this is impossible. We can't run anything. It takes all day to make a bank transfer. Of course, my bank in Brussels. What are we going to do? I said, should we try cable? And phone the telephone company and say it's not working. But that's fast internet. Not for me, it's not fast internet. In Europe, one of the targets of the digital agenda is to have 30 megabits per second access for all Europeans by 2013. You will see from the Digital Agenda Scoreboard, which I'm very glad you mentioned because it's my directorate that looks after that, there's all this information, and you will see that, and I'm going to show you a slide about it later, the data from last year showed that 54% of Europeans had access to 30 megabits per second. That was the end of last year, and we estimate that by the end of this year, 2013, which is what the target is, 98% will be covered by 30 megabits per second. Now, you know about upload and download, but at least this is what, in the United States, it's considered, at least where I'm living, in Cambridge, home of Harvard University, 1 megabit is considered high, is not good enough. So, but that gives you an indication, and I think in Canada, and I haven't seen the most recent figures, but I think you're doing relatively well in terms of broadband coverage, and particularly in some of the rural areas, and I think satellite has been an important factor in this for you, but the Canadians will tell you all about that. So these are the main pillars of the digital agenda. As I said at the beginning, we have wonderful institutional setup in Europe with the member states, parliament, the commission. I'm not going to bore you with all the details. But as I said too, it's really very important that all the stakeholders are involved and that everyone commits to this. And you will see from this too that many things are not even really within the power of the Commission itself. Some things are not within the power of each individual member state. Some things have to be done really at local level, and some are the responsibility of educational systems, etc. But they're all important and they all go together. So the digital single market is something that you won't be interested in, but it's important in a sort of global context for the following reasons. The digital single market is to make sure that trade works even better within Europe. The single market is one of the principal pillars of European integration. But of course, external trade is also important, and that's why we have now this discussion about what is called the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. There's a Canada-EU trade agreement which is being discussed, and of course, trade is very important. We have globalization of trade and economies, but still the digital single market is very important within Europe. So this is one of the pillars to try to encourage more e-commerce, make sure transactions cross borders, etc., etc. Interoperability and standards, and again, this is an area which is particularly global and has implications not just for Europe but for the whole world, because as you know very well, ICT doesn't stop at borders, internet doesn't stop at borders. These standards have implications all around the world. And one of the things that is being looked at in the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and I'm sure in the Canada-Europe Trade Agreement, is how to have better recognition of standards, how to improve our common work on standards, and particularly in this area, it's an area where we can really make a lot of progress. And once those standards are agreed and used, you have a huge portion of the world using common standards, which means that, this is the theory of course, that the rest of the world will sort of come along and use those standards too. So interoperability and standards, of course, is very important. Trust and security as well. If the system doesn't work, and you've heard all sorts of stories about cybersecurity attacks, then we will lose confidence of the users, consumers, everyone else who needs the system. And of course, from a defense perspective too, this is very important. We don't look at the defense aspects per se, but one of the things that was adopted in, I think it was in April this year, was the European cyber security strategy and a directive on improving cybersecurity. And this, of course, has had a lot of discussions also with the United States, of course, and I'm sure with various other countries. I must say, and here's something that you could pass the message back as well, even though Canada is one of the G8 members, and we do have a research and innovation dialogue limited with Canada, we don't really take Canada as seriously as I think we should in these international discussions. And particularly, to be perfectly blunt, because Canadians are not so interested. We've tried a number of times to increase the exchanges on research and innovation. We get lots of interest from the scientists, lots of interest from the researchers, but I suppose this is off the record. The government has not been very forthcoming in making sure budgets are there, etc. So I think this is something for those of you who are Canadians who have an influence on what goes on in your governments, either at national or at provincial level. This is something that I think could be improved, and we all stand to gain from it. Fast and ultra-fast internet access, well, I mentioned already all the studies that show that increased speed and higher broadband access has an important impact on GDP. I mentioned the 30 megabit per second target of the digital agenda for the end of 2013 for all Europeans. The 2020 targets are even more interesting. Let's say 50 megabits for everyone by 2020, and 50% of households to have 100 megabits per second. Now, at the time, and I remember very well when Nelly Cruz proposed these in the digital agenda in 2010, there was a lot of criticism, and people said, oh, this will never be used, this is ridiculous, this is just excessive, no one's going to need it, But when you look at Korea, at Japan, at some of the other countries who are getting close to those rates, you see that these really are probably going to have to even be revised in the next few years. Research and innovation, of course, is a very important area. I don't need to tell anyone in the room how important it is. And of course, because ICT has such an important influence on GDP and growth, the research and innovation in ICT is particularly important. And of course, it covers a huge and vast area. So what we have done now with the Horizon 2020 proposal, which was just adopted, well, it was adopted by the Commission some time ago, but there's a political agreement now with the member states. And that is the research and innovation package for the next 7 years from 2014 on. There is an important part of ICT there, but it's also integrated into all sorts of other areas, like social welfare, like health, like environmental studies, and the ICT element is integrated into those areas. Now, enhancing digital literacy skills and inclusion, of course, are also very important, but they really depend very much on the local, regional partners, and the same for ICT-enabled benefits for EU society. In the Commission, we have a number of actions that try to support and push these activities, but really it takes a lot of initiative and a lot of support from the member states. And Gilles, I'm sure, will tell you about this, because this is something that the digital champions, of which there's one in almost every EU country, are really pushing within their national environments. So that's what the digital agenda was. This is the review, which I mentioned in December, revamped a bit and reprioritized some of the areas. The new and stable broadband regulatory environment, those of you who follow these things will have seen that Nelly Cruz is making a proposal, well, it's already been adopted by the Commission, to change slightly the regulatory environment in Europe to, well, it's very complicated. I'm not going to go into details, but those of you who know the CRTC or who work for the CRTC will know how complicated and complex these things are. You can imagine how this is at the level of 28 different countries, each with their own national regulatory authority, and trying to make sure that this all works together. Roaming, of course, is one aspect that's important, but we have a roaming regulation that's covered. The other really is trying to make sure that the pricing and provisions in that regulation are better and that there's a more level playing field. New public digital service infrastructures are also particularly important, and I think Gilles is going to speak to you a bit more about that. One area where we think there's a lot of room for development and for further innovation, let's call it, and further growth is in the public sector innovation. Use of cloud computing by public sector, moving to e-procurement, using digital forms, tax forms, etc., etc. And this, of course, is very efficient. It reduces costs, and this is an area where we think we can make really a lot of progress. The Grand Coalition on Digital Skills and Jobs is something, those of you who are very fast will have noticed that on one of the previous slides I had identified a problem that we have in Europe, and I'm sure you have it here too, that it's been estimated that by 2015 there will be about 1 million jobs required in the ICT area for which we don't find people with the right skills. Doesn't mean that we don't have electrical engineers or we don't have business students or we don't have whatever it may be, but they don't have the right combination of skills that industry says is needed for the work. So the idea is to try to make sure that we work together with industry, with education authorities, with national authorities to make sure that we have the right people with the right skills. And there are all sorts of very interesting examples, and I'm sure Gilles will give you some too, just of small efforts, taking long-term unemployed people, giving them some basic coding or programming skills, and they immediately are out on the market working. And so these are really very satisfying and very useful action. So this Grand Coalition is a real effort to try to dynamize the area and make sure that we have the right people to fill these jobs. The cybersecurity strategy and directive I've already mentioned, so this has already been done. Updating the EU copyright directive, Again, this is something relating, of course, to EU-wide activities and furthering the single market, because you want to make sure that you have similar copyright provisions that are adapted for a digital age within the European Union. The cloud computing strategy, and again, public sector commitment there is particularly important. So this cloud computing strategy has been adopted, and we're trying to make sure that this works even better. I'm not sure, probably the Canadians were hit by the PRISM initiative, let's call it, of the United States as well as everyone else. So one aspect of cloud computing, as you probably know, relates also to data privacy and personal information privacy. So it's an important aspect in cloud computing, and this is one of the things that is being looked at also in the context of cloud computing. And a new electronics industrial strategy, or the Airbus of chips, is being proposed and being rolled out in the context of Horizon 2020, which is this new research and innovation program that we are going through now. So I will try not to talk too much about the single market, because this is very EU-centric, but it's also important externally. And I think it's useful in Canada in the context of NAFTA, for example, because as I said, the problem with the internal single market is that in the digital context, things don't necessarily pass as well as they should. We see that more and more consumers are using e-commerce, but they're not using interstate e-commerce as much as they should be, or as much as we would like them to. So if you're in Germany, you're not necessarily buying from France on the internet. Or if you're in Switzerland, which is outside the EU, of course, but they still buy a lot from the other EU countries, you're not necessarily buying from Germany, etc. There is much more regional exchanges and much more regional commerce, but we would like to see a much greater increase. So, of course, making sure that the digital single market works is really very important. So this is on e-commerce. I'm not going to go into details about this. Again, as was said earlier, you can see all these data on the scoreboard, and I recommend that you look at it. It's very interesting also to compare with what's going on in Canada. These are all just details and data that you can look at. And I think these, you can probably make these slides available to people. I don't think there's anything secret. So I'll skip through all of this, telecoms, global market, interoperability and standards. And again, I think here is an area where, of course, we're working very hard within Europe, but I think we have a real interest in working with other countries. We work a lot with the United States, a lot with the Chinese, a lot with the Japanese. And I must say, as I said earlier, less so with Canada. And, you know, you're all interested in it. It's something that has implications for all of us, and perhaps it's because the Canadians just use the US standards. I don't know, but it's been much less evident, and I think it's an area where we could really work a bit better together. So I'm not going to go into the detail. The same on trust and security. Again, because it has international implications, it has international obligations, we want to make sure that we have an internationally sound internet, something that works for everybody. This is an area as well where I think we could make a lot more progress in working together. Fast internet supply and demand, I've mentioned this briefly. This just gives you an indication of where we are now. In fact, I think these data are quite old, but they're updating continuously. But the same correlation between broadband penetration and competitiveness, of course, continues. This I'll skip. Again, speeding up public sector innovation, I think, is an area where we have a lot of potential. And we've seen it, for example, in the United States, where the former the former chief, I think he was called Chief Information Technologist or Chief Information Advisor to Obama, insisted that all the national agencies and government authorities in the United States start to use cloud computing. And they've reduced dramatically the costs. It's something that we want to do in Europe as well, and we're working hard on trying to do this. And of course, in Canada, this is something that you have an interest in doing as well. Cloud computing, again, the same, and also in the context of public sector innovation. And e-procurement I've mentioned as well. Entrepreneurship, digital skills and jobs, I think I'll leave Gilles to speak about this. But it's clear that we have a real potential to drive forward and encourage web entrepreneurs. You've seen, I'm sure, in Canada, the BlackBerry, which was a great, it wasn't based on the web per se, but it's something that really was very dramatic and very dynamic in its time. Now it has to go through some changes. In Canada, you have all these high-tech companies who are really still continuing to drive forward activities. They have a bit of a thrive and burn cycle sometimes, but it's an area where I think there's a lot of potential to go. The Grand Coalition I'm not going to go into because it's very Eurocentric, but it's similar to the issues that you have here. And the same for this. This is just really information that you can always look. So here's a piece of information from the scoreboard, which is what you mentioned, the Digital Agenda Scoreboard, giving some data on where we are. And again, this gives you all sorts of possibilities to look at different combinations, different charts, different ways of assessing the information and combining it. So I'm not going to speak any longer because we have lots of other things to talk about, but you can look at these slides at your leisure. And I pass the floor to Gilles, who can tell you about the French experience. Thanks.
It's always a real pleasure to be in a university, which is obviously a place of knowledge, and to speak about all these great topics. But it's, on the other hand, a little bit difficult to speak just after you, Megan, because you so well spoke about all these issues that I had to rewrite my whole speech so that it still stay interesting for you. You know, I wanted to probably tackle this with a different angle, which is more obviously from the entrepreneur viewpoint. But not only. I spent 20 years, 25 years actually, setting up companies and trying to grow these companies. And at some point I wanted to probably better understand why Europe was probably lagging behind in terms of having big companies like in the US. And I actually got involved in this ecosystems of institution. I was appointed the chairman of the National Digital Council. I also worked in a think tank called Institut Montaigne in France about productivity issues. And I found it really great, which makes that at this stage I'm kind of challenging between my entrepreneurial life and this new life in some way. My business partner doesn't like it so much, but I'm happy to do that as well. I would like to speak about a few ideas and thoughts that I believe are quite important to have in mind regarding this new era of knowledge economy as such. I think the first thing we need to consider is that it's just the beginning. To me, it's the comparison that we could do is the one with electricity, and I believe to that extent we're probably in 1880. You know, at really the beginning of this new era. It's just starting, and the thing we need to have in mind is that it took a lot of time, you know, before we see the real inputs of electricity into everybody's life. It's actually, we didn't see any increase of the productivity before 1910, yes, 30 years after. You know, so, and the reason why it took so long is that we had to have a generation shift of managers into factories, into the economic system, so that the increase becomes obviously efficient. And I believe we need to avoid that. We need to make sure that everything is made so that the digital economy can become a reality in everybody's life and change the life of everyone. I believe that overall, this new economy is probably of a stronger revolution than the electricity one. It's touching everything. It's basically touching everything. And therefore, we need to make sure that on any field, we can decide on what we want. Not only take it as it is, but make it ours. And I think that for Europe, it's not only a matter of trying to do the same thing than the US or other places, but to make it ours in the sense that we want to build up our own social model, social digital model as well. And that's important because it's not only a question of productivity, of education, of whatever. It's about what we want to do with it. I would want to probably speak about three things, which I believe are kind of the most important to me in terms of what we can do right now with the digital era. The first is obviously education. Education is, I mean, we are getting into a real breakthrough. I think it's comparable to the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg like 500 years ago. He created the Enlightenment in some way, you know, the fact that we could distribute easily at no cost or at little cost great ideas, created it. And it's the same thing in here. I just wanted to give you an idea of how big is that revolution. The first MOOC, Massive Online Open Course, has been created in 2011 by Sebastian Thrun. Sebastian Thrun is a teacher at the Stanford University, and he was teaching artificial intelligence. He had traditionally 200 people in each of his course, which lasted for a year. And he once thought that he could probably get to 1,000 using internet means. So he spent 6 months setting up the first MOOC, actually, a platform to distribute the content. And he was hoping to, he felt that he would hit success if he could have like 1,000 people subscribing to his free offering of internet, of his course, actually. And when he first launched it, after 2 weeks, he had 15,000 subscribers. And after 6 weeks, he had 100,000. And when he indeed launched it, he had 160,000 people who have committed to follow his course. After a year, Sebastian Thrun said that he thinks that 23,000 people had the same level of knowledge than the 200 people who were part of his course. So you can see that there is a breakthrough, not only in the fact that there are a larger number of people who have this very high-end knowledge of computer science, but also in the sense that these people are not all in Stanford. They are all over the world, in Africa, in Asia, in poor places, all the places where usually you don't find this kind of skills. And this is something which is obviously extremely, it's a turning point for humanity, I believe. So to that extent, I believe that one of the things we need to really be careful about is to make sure that we have our own way of building up MOOCs and making sure that this type of these systems of education represent who we are as a European people. And this is something I think we should really consider as one of our key focuses. And I believe that overall the notion of education has to be reconsidered. You all know the PISA score. It's been set up in 1999. And it's shown that most of the countries who are trusting the best places are actually developing countries or former developing countries, like Korea, which used to be one of the poorer countries like just 20 years ago. They are the first in the PISA. So I believe that it puts some pressure on our educational system, and we need to start rethinking it. It's not only about filling up kids' brain, but in the knowledge economy, it's more about learning to learn. And this is a very big challenge, actually. It's not only about computers. It's about the way we teach our kids. And we think we should really start to do some strong, I would say, scientific research about the way we should teach our kids, because it's the way we will set up our future. So that is, I believe, very tied to the digital era, because everything is possible. Utopia is possible. We can do basically new type of education system which promotes the notion of co-education, of co-creation, of making kids work together. I invite you to look at the work of some great people in this era. Sugata Mitra, the Indian researcher, as well as Salman Khan, the one who set up Khan Academy. These people are really telling us that we should completely reconsider the education system at all levels. Password. The second aspect, I believe, which is of great interest, is the health system. In Europe, we are spending in between 9 and 12% of the GDP for the health system. It's a lot of money, and it's increasing fast. I believe that if we keep on with this current system, which uses a lot of chemistry, it won't work. You know, it's already dying. If you look at the mortality rate in the emergency field, it's growing. So, which means that there is something wrong. Emergency service has been increasing in terms of quality over the past 30 years. It's been improving thanks to a lot of technology, and since 3 years, in at least France and a few other countries, it's now declining. It's declining because it costs a lot to pay people. It's declining also because the treatment we're using are not as efficient it was in many ways, and it's also declining because we cannot afford to have I would say local hospital in places where there are now a larger amount of population than it was in the past. So I believe to that extent, consider the digital opportunity is really interesting. If you think about the fact that now we are considering that we could plug some high-end measurement system, health measurement system to a smartphone, we can probably get to a point where, you know, the pre-diagnostic is not up to I would say, the core system, but is left to us, you know, the citizens, the people who need care. And that's something which is now a big field of research, especially in the US, but also in Asia. And I think that it pushes us to really reconsider the way the health system works. You all heard about this notion of quantified health. I believe that this will be a big breakthrough, and it can completely change the way we deal with the health processes. Also, if you add to that this new revolution about DNA, the fact that the cost of sampling the DNA is going down and down is also a very strong revolution. And if you mix this together, the notion of self-quantifying of DNA and of measurement overall, you get to the point where you need to consider that at the core center of the health system can be big data. And I believe that's a place where Europe should be probably more involved. It's important to have some deep concerns about privacy issues, but we need to balance that with the fact that we have to be able to deal with all these numbers, all this data, to make sure that we can set up a new era of health system. In the health field, there is also something which is interesting. I could speak about that too long for now, but it's the notion of co-creation, the notion of involving all the stakeholders, the patients, the doctors, and the families, and so on. It's interesting to see that some people have been basically saved by involving these different categories of people in the way they should treat themselves. There is a guy in Italy, he was diagnosed with a brain cancer. His doctor told him that he would die, and he asked basically everyone on the internet what he should do. And this guy is now sane in some way. He has treated his cancer thanks to a community of 8,000 different people over the internet. And this shows that all this together, there is probably a route for a new type of health system. The third notion I believe we should think of is the notion of productivity overall. In the US, over the 3 last years, 2009 to 2011, on which we have statistics of productivity, it shows that the productivity increase has been the highest ever. So the US are now experiencing a new gold era of productivity. And when you speak with the economical academics about the reason that's behind this new productivity increase, they clearly said it's thanks to the digital capabilities overall. So I believe that we're entering into an era of where utopia is becoming possible, on which that we're going to be able to produce so much that we're going to be able to fill up a lot of people's needs. And what is interesting is that it's not only touching the manufacturing sector, but also the service sector. And you need to think that services represent 80% of the job in the developed economy. So it's interesting because it's a challenge in the sense that we're going to be able to access to high-end services for low cost probably, but on the other hand, we need to think of what's going to be the works we're going to leave to people in the future. And I believe that's a very big challenge. Will everyone have some work tomorrow? It's not sure. I mean, it's not obvious. I would like to say that it's clear that it's gonna. We all be able to have some good works, but it's something we need to think about. You have to think that the notion of work as we know it, waged work, is only 200 years old, and it could at some point disappear. I know it seems a little bit bizarre to say, but it's something we need to think as well. And overall, there is also some interesting trends in the evolution of this new productivity, so to say. The fact that we see a lot of relocalization of services and manufacturing, thanks, for instance, to the Fab Lab phenomena, is interesting as well. So it doesn't challenge us only to think about how we can increase that, but it also challenges us to think on a way that we want to build it up and to set up a society that will be very inclusive. So that's the big challenge. And believe to me, what strikes me is that when we were in the 60s, we were thinking about utopia, but we didn't have the tool to set up the utopia. And now we are in an era where we have the tool to set up utopia, but we don't think about it. And I believe it's time to do it. It's time to consider what type of society we want to build. And I think that's a challenge which is interesting for Europe, because Europe has been, I believe, probably very strongly inclined to think about how we can set up an inclusive society. It's at the core of Europe, and I think that should be part of what we should now do, is to think about how we can set up Europe. So I would like to end up to speak about why I believe that the state is important in setting up all this new digital era. The first thing I'd like to say is that if you look at the places which are the most innovative in the world, you won't see only the invisible end. You will also see a lot of state end. You'll see that either in California, in Massachusetts, in Israel, in somewhere in Sweden, the state is very strongly behind the initial setup of all this ecosystem. So Megan spoke a lot about the notions that are the most important. I believe that the state shall show the example, for instance, by using the cloud and making that, if you want to interface as a company with the state, you need to be able to deal with the same type of technology, so to be yourself using the cloud. There is also the fact that standards obviously are extremely important, and to me, it's the problem with standard is that it's left to technical bodies, and we are getting into a point where standard is probably the new. I would say it's almost a weapon. It's the way you decide on what's your sovereignty, what's yours. For instance, probably the best standard that Europe created was GSM. GSM has been set up by 4 countries in 1986 with the very strong support of the EU, the European Community by then. And it's now used by 5 billion and 200 million people. So we're all using it basically. And I believe it's a very right example of what a state can do. The reason why those 4 countries were working together is just because I would say ITC, it was telecommunication minister by then, told them, we can support you, but we won't support you if you do just a norm that is for our national countries, because it's too small. So you need to make sure that you come together and you work together to set this norm all together. And by doing so, we were able to involve everybody. I mean, the regulators, the state, the companies, and it's something we should redo. We should do every day. We have plenty of opportunity of norms, and this norm will not only decide of our competitiveness, but also on the type of standard we want to see to emerge. And I could give you plenty of examples, but for instance, in cars, in the safety of food, the traceability of food, in the telecommunication sectors, I mean, any type of sectors, there are new norms to be set up, and these norms are typically the type of things that will make that Europe will exist and be successful or not. So this why this is the type of mission that the state can do, and the state can also probably, thank you, probably drive innovation toward a longer term. You know, the state shall bring people and companies into places where companies wouldn't go by themselves. You know, when you say, I don't know, we believe that there is probably something interesting in a network that is 1 terabyte speed. Obviously, most companies would say it's just plain stupid and impossible to do. But just by doing so, by pouring some research funding into there, you would strongly enhance the quality of the level of innovation in this space. So that's the reason why I believe that states have the say in this innovation era. Another thing which is obvious is you need to balance the regulation with complexity. And as an entrepreneur, especially in France, you know, I've been struggling with the fact that we have too much regulation, and the regulation is basically, I would say, not enforcing innovation in the sense that it helps innovation, it fosters innovation, but sometimes it's too complicated. So it's a very strong challenge to state, and also the digital era challenge state in itself. I mean, most of the services that are rendered by states can be probably made more efficiently through the cloud and so on. So it's not only a revolution for we people and for entrepreneurs, it's also a very strong revolution for states. And one of the things which I found the most difficult it's to explain to ministers and governmental bodies that they have to reconsider the role and they cannot keep behaving like they are. And I would end up with this. I think that it's also a challenge for democracy. We've seen a lot of riots, a lot of people who were unhappy all over the world in developing and developed countries. And I think that what people are saying is basically they want to have with state probably an interaction which is kind of the same than the one they have with in the internet. You know, they don't want to be represented; they want to participate, and that's probably the most important challenge, the most difficult challenge to deal with. It's to change the institution so that it's not only being like receiving the messages from the state and from the government, but making sure that people can share, can be part of it. Actually, if you look at Wikipedia, Wikipedia is probably the largest sum of knowledge that has been ever set up. And you know, it's extremely interesting to see that everyone can be part of it, but excellency is still the rule. You know, so I believe that we need to set up at the state level something which makes that we can come to a synthesis of decision which is the best for everyone and which involve everybody. So you can see that there are tons of challenges we need to deal with, and I hope that Europe will not only I would say let the digital economy invade Europe, but also decide on the type of digital era we want to have. Thank you.